There are men who believe themselves chosen by God to cleanse the world of its impurities. They speak of justice while wielding cruelty, of salvation while sowing destruction. But what happens when such a man discovers that the very corruption he seeks to purge has taken root in his own soul? Tonight, we witness the fall of a self-appointed savior whose vision of purity is really a glimpse into madness. Nathaniel Prewitt stood at the edge of Salem's town square, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones. His black coat hung perfectly pressed, his white collar unmarked by dust or doubt. He was a man of precision, a man of purpose, a man who believed himself chosen by the Almighty to serve as his instrument of judgment. The townsfolk whispered his name with a mixture of reverence and fear. Magistrate Prewitt, the witch hunter, the man who had sent 17 souls to their maker in the past year alone. 17, he murmured to himself, savoring the number like communion wine. 17 servants of darkness, purged from this godly community. His pale eyes surveyed the square where the stake still stood from yesterday's execution. Martha Hadley had been the latest, a spinster who had dared to question his methods in open court. She had called him cruel, called him merciless. Nathaniel's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Mercy was weakness. Mercy was the devil's tool. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Constable Hartwell emerged from the town jail, his weathered face grim with purpose. Magistrate Prewitt, Hartwell said, touching his cap. The witch Mercy Till is ready for sentencing. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Mercy Till, the herbalist who had lived on the outskirts of town for 30 years. A woman who had helped birth half the children in Salem, who had tended the sick, who had never spoken a crossword to anyone until yesterday. Yesterday, when young Timothy Morse had fallen ill with fever, and Mercy had given him a tonic that saved his life. But the boy had babbled in his delirium, babbled about seeing angels with black wings, about hearing voices in the forest. Clearly the work of the devil. Nathaniel followed Hartwell into the dim stone building that served as their jail. The cells were small, cramped things, barely large enough for a man to lie down. In the furthest cell sat Mercy Till. She was smaller than Nathaniel remembered. Her gray hair hung in thin wisps around a face carved by 70 years of New England winters. Her hands, those terrible hands that had mixed potions and cast spells, rested quietly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and Nathaniel was surprised to see no fear in her eyes. Only sadness. Mercy Till, he began, his voice echoing off the stone walls. You stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with the devil, of corrupting the youth of this godly community. She said nothing. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Young Timothy Morse's own testimony. The strange herbs found in your dwelling, your unnatural knowledge of healing. Still, she remained silent. Nathaniel felt his anger rising. This was the moment they always broke, when faced with the righteous fury of God's chosen instrument. They pleaded, they begged, they confessed their sins and threw themselves upon the mercy of the court. But Mercy Till simply sat there, watching him with those calm gray eyes. You will burn in 3 days' time, Nathaniel said finally. May God have mercy on your soul. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. Nathaniel Prewitt. Her voice contained a sense of power and contempt. He looked back, expecting to see terror, desperation, the usual last-minute attempt to bargain for life. Instead, Mercy Till was smiling. You fear sin like a plague, don't you? She said confidently. You see it everywhere, in every shadow, in every kind word or gentle touch. You've spent your life trying to purge it from this world. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. I do God's work. Her smile widened. Do you? There was something in it that made his skin crawl. Then let me view a gift, Magistrate. Let me help you become what you've always claimed to be. She reached through the bars then, her aged fingers closing around his wrist with surprising strength. Her touch was cold. Cold as winter earth, cold as the grave. You want to be the plague that cleanses sin from this world? She whispered. Then be the plague. Nathaniel jerked his hand away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Mercy Till's laughter followed him as he fled the jail, a sound like wind through dead leaves, like the whisper of flames consuming dry wood. That night, sleep brought no peace. He dreamed of fields, endless fields of withered corpses. The sky above was the color of ash, and the air tasted of copper and decay. He walked among the dead, and with each step more bodies appeared. Men, women, children, all twisted and blackened, their faces frozen in silent screams. And through it all, Mercy Till's laughter echoed like thunder. Nathaniel woke in a cold sweat, his nightclothes soaked with perspiration. Dawn was breaking through his bedroom window, painting the walls in shades of blood and gold. His wife Rebecca stirred beside him. "Nathaniel," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Are you well?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt his heart clench. Rebecca, sweet, gentle Rebecca, who had never spoken a harsh word in her life, who had borne him two beautiful children and never questioned his work, never questioned his methods. "I'm fine," he whispered, reaching out to touch her face. The moment his fingers brushed her cheek, Rebecca's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream, and before Nathaniel could pull away, her skin began to change. It dried, it withered, it cracked like old parchment. Rebecca's face collapsed inward, her eyes sinking into dark hollows, her beautiful auburn hair turning gray and brittle. In seconds, she was nothing but a husk, a dried shell of what had once been his beloved wife. Nathaniel screamed. He scrambled backward, falling from the bed, his hands shaking as he stared at what remained of Rebecca. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. "Papa?" He turned to see his children standing in the doorway. Thomas, age 7, and little Mary, barely 4. Their faces were pale with confusion and fear. "Papa, what's wrong with Mama?" Thomas asked. Nathaniel tried to speak, tried to warn them away, but they were already running toward him, already reaching out with their small, trusting hands. "No," he whispered, "no, don't." But it was too late. The moment they touched him, the same terrible transformation began. His children, his beautiful, innocent children, withered and died in his arms. Their warmth turned to ash. Nathaniel knelt there on the bedroom floor, surrounded by the remains of his family, and understood with crystal clarity what Mercy Till had done to him. He had become death itself. The next hours passed in a blur of horror. Nathaniel wrapped his hands in cloth and stumbled through the streets of Salem, seeking help, seeking answers, seeking some way to undo what had been done. But everywhere he went, death followed. Reverend Alder took one look at him and recoiled in terror. "Witchcraft," the old man hissed. "You've brought the devil's curse upon yourself." "Please," Nathaniel begged. "You have to help me. I didn't. This isn't what it seems." But Alder was already backing away, his face twisted with disgust and fear. "Stay away from me, you cursed thing. Stay away from all of us." Nathaniel fled into the forest, hoping that solitude might contain the horror he had become. But even nature rejected him. Birds fell from the trees at his approach. Flowers blackened and died. The very ground seemed to retreat from his footsteps. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. For 3 days, he wandered the wilderness, eating nothing, drinking nothing, sustained only by the terrible curse that had consumed his life. On the 4th day, desperation drove him back to Salem, back to the jail, back to Mercy Till. She was sitting in exactly the same position as before, her hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes calm and knowing. She looked up as he approached, and that same maddening smile crossed her face. "Magistrate Prewitt," she said pleasantly, "how nice to see you again." "Please," he whispered, pressing his cloth-wrapped hands against the bars. "Please, I beg you, lift this curse. I'll do anything you ask." Mercy Till's smile widened. "Anything?" "Yes. Free me." Nathaniel's heart leaped. Here was his chance, his one hope for redemption. All he had to do was unlock the cell, and surely God would forgive him. Surely the curse would be lifted. His hand moved toward the key ring at his belt, then stopped. What would the townspeople say? What would Reverend Alder think? His reputation, his standing in the community, his role as God's chosen instrument. "I can't," he whispered. Mercy Till's laughter filled the jail. "Of course you can't. You're still the same man, Nathaniel Prewitt. Still so proud, still so righteous, still so afraid of what others might think." "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The curse will lift when you die, when justice is served." "Will it?" She leaned forward, her eyes glittering in the dim light. "Tell me, Magistrate, what makes you think this is about me at all?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his mind reeling. I don't understand." "Don't you?" Mercy Till's voice was gentle now, almost motherly. You've spent your entire life believing that sin was something outside yourself, something you could hunt down and destroy. But what if the real corruption was already inside you? What if it always had been? Nathaniel shook his head frantically. No, no, I'm righteous. I'm chosen. I do God's work. Whose work were you doing when you condemned 17 innocent people to die? Whose work were you doing when you ignored evidence of their innocence? Whose work were you doing when you chose pride over mercy, judgment over compassion? The walls of the jail seemed to be closing in around him. Nathaniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like a funeral drum. You're wrong, he gasped. You're wrong about everything. Am I? Mercy Till stood up, her frail form somehow radiating power. Then prove it, Magistrate. Show me your mercy. Show me your compassion. Set me free. But Nathaniel was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. He could hear her laughter following him, could feel her eyes burning into his back. At dawn, they came for her. Nathaniel stood in the town square, surrounded by the people of Salem, and watched as Mercy Till was led to the stake. She moved with dignity, her head held high, her gray hair catching the morning light. As they bound her to the wooden post, she looked directly at him. Last chance, Magistrate, she called out. Choose mercy. Nathaniel said nothing. The flames began to rise. Mercy Till never screamed, never begged, never showed any sign of pain or fear. She simply stood there, wreathed in fire and smoke, and laughed. It was the most terrible sound Nathaniel had ever heard. As the flames consumed her, he felt a surge of triumph. Surely now the curse would be broken. Surely now he would be free to resume his holy work. He reached out and grasped the shoulder of Constable Hartwell, who stood beside him. Hartwell's scream shattered the morning air. The man collapsed, his body withering and drying like autumn leaves. The crowd scattered in terror, but Nathaniel barely noticed. He was staring at Mercy Till's remains, at the charred bones and ash that had once been a woman. She was still laughing, not with her voice. Her voice was gone. But the laughter was there, echoing in his mind, reverberating through his soul. You see? Her voice whispered inside his head. It was never about me. It was never about magic or curses or the devil. It was about you, Nathaniel Prewitt. It was always about you. The revelation hit him like lightning. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was spiritual. It was the physical manifestation of what he had always been. A bringer of death, a destroyer of innocence, a plague upon the world. Mercy Till hadn't cursed him. She had simply revealed him. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Reverend Alder stood at the edge of the square, flanked by a dozen armed men. Their faces were grim with purpose. Nathaniel Prewitt, Alder called out, by the authority of this godly community, I arrest you for the practice of witchcraft. Nathaniel almost laughed. The irony was perfect. He had spent his life hunting witches, and now he would die as one. They dragged him to the same cell where Mercy Till had waited for death. They bound his hands with iron shackles. They read him the charges in voices filled with righteous fury, and through it all, he could hear her laughter. That night, alone in the darkness, Nathaniel Prewitt finally understood the true nature of his curse. He had always believed himself chosen by God, but he had been wrong about which God. He was not an instrument of divine justice. He was a servant of something far darker. He had fed on fear and suffering for so long that he had become fear and suffering incarnate. The curse hadn't changed him. It had simply stripped away the lies he told himself. At dawn, they came for him. The townspeople gathered in the square, the same people who had once praised his righteousness, who had once called him a pillar of the community. Now they watched with hungry eyes as he was led to the stake. I was chosen, he screamed as they bound him to the wooden post. I was doing God's work. I was trying to save you all. But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Salem had found their new witch, their new scapegoat, their new target for righteous fury. As the flames began to lick at his boots, Nathaniel felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. The fire rose higher, and through the smoke and heat, he saw her one last time. Mercy Till, standing at the edge of the crowd, her gray hair flowing in a wind that touched no one else, she was smiling. There, her voice whispered in his ear. Now you understand. Nathaniel Prewitt died as he had lived, bound, burning, condemned by frightened people convinced they were righteous. But in his final moments, he heard something that surprised him. Laughter. His own laughter. The town square stood empty once more. Ash drifted through the morning air, carried by the autumn wind. The stake had been reduced to charred splinters, and the crowds had dispersed back to their daily lives. But in the silence that followed, something strange occurred. At the base of the blackened stake, where Nathaniel Prewitt's ashes had settled into the earth, a single flower began to bloom. A rose, black as midnight, its petals dried and withered yet somehow beautiful. It stood there for a moment, swaying in the breeze before crumbling to dust and blowing away. And in the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of laughter. Pride, they say, goeth before the fall. But what of the man who mistakes his fall for his rise? What of the soul so corrupted by its own righteousness that it can no longer distinguish between salvation and damnation? In the end, Nathaniel Prewitt got exactly what he had always wanted, to be God's chosen instrument. He simply discovered too late which God had chosen him.